Good evening, everyone. We are together at the 24th video of the Divine Order and the Universe Reading and Commentary series. Welcome, Ümit.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
This evening, we will go deeper into the topic of the being. And the passages we will read this evening contain introductions to topics which will be detailed in the further pages of this book. Let's start reading from where we left last week. After giving this general knowledge about influences, we will talk about the influences arriving at a man. What is called man is a body constituted by a being that collects crude matter together in the earth sphere for utilizing as a vehicle for itself in order to serve the spirit it is connected to. The being can constitute this body only with the help and directives of the sublime beings in duty. We have said that actually the being is also composed only of very subtle particles concentrated in a point of the universe, and a complex of certain energies or influences carrying all expressions of the needs of the spirit throughout universe. However, we would like to make it clear that the concept of point mentioned here should not be thought of as a fixed, frozen space in comparison with the concept of space in the world. This is a concept which is hard and often impossible to understand and to explain under these physical conditions. Let us say on this topic that it should not be understood in the physical sense but in the perceptual sense. This is such a point that wherever comprehension is posited, it is there. So, that point is both at a given space in the universe and also everywhere. Whoever thinks about this topic will start to intuit many things in this regard. This intuition will be beneficial not only for this topic but for solving many other problems as well. Knowledge of perceptual space or spherical space on the following pages will be preparing mankind in a better way for this intuition. So, the being is an ensemble of influences or energies gathered at a point that must be accepted in this sense. And these belong to a spirit. A being that is composed of such very subtle energies or influences, which cannot be measured by the superficial concepts of time and space as understood by mankind, cannot directly influence the crude spheres of the cosmoses. However, spirits also need to encounter, during their various applications, the matter of these crude spheres. For, the being who will serve the spirit, in other words, who will be able to execute the necessities of subservience to spirit, needs to build a body for itself out of the matter of that sphere. So, in accordance with this necessity, helper beings in duty, by going into action, assist it. The being becomes connected, through the influences coming from its spirit, to this built body and governing it, and this is called incarnation, as we have previously said. It happens like this. First of all, in the sphere where the application is to be done, a family unit duality, that is, the coming together of a man and a woman to constitute a unit, is required. After this need is fulfilled, by the assisting beings in duty, the seeds of man and woman are united to make an impregnated ovum. The being makes connection with this impregnated ovum. Here, the being, by intervening in the magnetic fields of the beings belonging to brain cells, consigns them to build the brain of the embryo, more correctly, its brain cells. The human being, while it has been in the spatium, was already keeping these hundreds of thousands of brain cell beings together and influencing their magnetic fields. In this way, brain cells beings build their bodies, that is, brain cells with the human being's influence and help. The being constructs the other parts of the nervous system via this brain which has also been constructed. After this is accomplished, it generates all other formations of the body via the nervous system. While constructing the body, materials of the mother are utilized. That is, bodily materials of the fetus which is in formation are taken out of the materials constituting the body of its mother. The being prevailing over the human body is influential and governs directly over the magnetic field synthesis, which is constituted of the magnetic fields of hundreds of thousands of beings belonging to brain cells. That is, the body is managed by the brain cells. However, this management is under the governance of the energies ensemble, which is the being of the body and belonging to a spirit, of the human being. Well, that's a long passage, so let's pause and discuss this part.
This passage starts with comprehension, then moves into the being and then gives knowledge about the physical body. So here, the book reinforces the connection with these three in our minds.
Yes, we read here, the perceptual point the being is built from the high energies of the superhydrogen cosmos. This point is both at a given space in the universe and also everywhere, because it is ensemble of comprehension and energies, consequently, wherever comprehension is posited, it is there.
Our friends can watch our previous videos, preferably, starting from the second one onwards, to understand the stages before this state of being occurs. Yes, the spirit has evolutionary needs that we cannot know, and the being it builds works as a body within the universe, at its superhydrogen realm, that is, above the hydrogen cosmos. This is such a body of high energies that the being reflects the behaviors of the spirit in the matter universe, and the being, as a body for the spirit, will be in service to it until the end of the universe. And this newly emerged being that has a complex ensemble of energies immediately begins to build a body for itself from the cruder matter of the hydrogen cosmos, with the help of beings in duty. Remember, the organ-organizer relation? Just like we discussed that topic, these strata occur. Because spirit and matter cannot be in direct relation, they need an efficient intermediary, and this is the being. Because the spirit needs to evolve by getting experienced through the reflections of its influences in the matter universe, and because the matter needs to develop to respond to those needs of the spirit by the possibilities inherent in its structure, a body that must be an exchange between increasingly higher energies of the subtler realms and the relatively cruder matter possibilities for more combinations and experiences is needed. And this is the being. And the topic of comprehension. Well, what we will read in the further pages of this book may be staggering for our new friends. When the divine order in the universe is made public, almost 10 years ago, the topic of comprehension was the most studied topic among our members and friends. It is so easy to describe it by using the sentences of the book. Comprehension is a power interconnecting the endless matter systems in the matter universe. But this is a memorized sentence.
Easy to say.
Yes, but to understand this, to grasp the true meaning of this is entirely something else. So, we read here, we would like to make it clear that the concept of a point mentioned here should not be thought of as a fixed, frozen space in comparison with the concept of space in the world. This is a concept which is hard and often impossible to understand. Now, I am here, you are there, and this table will be here in the morning. All around us, there are fixed things, matter combinations, even images. However, in the further pages, when we will the topic of spherical time, the book states that we need help from our power of imagination, we need to spend efforts so we can gain some initial intuitions that may lead to stronger intuitions. So, this is a topic we need to concentrate, to focus on. And there will be seemingly contradicting concepts. Comprehension is both in a point and also everywhere. The 7/8 of our being's influence and energy is here and bring out my consciousness. Our being constantly sending its energy and influence, and if it withdraws it, then its involvement with this body ends, and death, in the worldly sense, occurs.
And our being is not in our cosmos. It is in a higher semi-subtle realm that is above the hydrogen cosmos.
And exists within the spatial conditions and possibilities of the spherical time. And our being does everything within the comprehension of the spherical time, that is, managing the body it built, receiving influences via the superconsciousness, reflecting influences it acquires via essential knowledge. And this is a time comprehension beyond us, because we live by superficial time, and we think in terms of past, present, and future. And soon, we will read about the spherical time where infinite lines of past, present, future happen at the same moment. So, you may understand that why I say it is beyond our comprehension. Yes, of course, we can gain some simple intuitions about this, The book states that it is possible for us, but still this requires lots of efforts from us and our imagination. When we read in this passage, a point that wherever comprehension is posited, it is there. We need to understand that this is not our worldly comprehension, this is the essential comprehension of our being. Now, we know that spirit and matter are in an indirect exchange. And once the being is built, prime influences leave their place to primary values from the other beings and evolutionary values from the spirit. However, evolutionary values are not directly coming from the spirit, no, these are from the force of the original principle particular to the matter universe, and filtered from the unitary. These influences or the necessities enter the unitary in accordance with the behaviors and stirrings of the spirit, as a respond to these behaviors and bring the material equivalent of these necessities by the being the spirit built from the high energies and then, reflected back to the spirit via its being. And that's how tests and trials of the spirit and its being begins, because the secondary influences, experiences, learnings begin. Initial steps of freedom begin. A rather active evolution phase begins. So, with the building of the being, the influences sent from the force of the original principle particular to our universe and filtered through the unitary will lend expressions to this being. And these influences will begin building focal points which are not stable or fixed but expressing the momentary needs of the spirit. And the same expression is reflected back to spirit via the same channel of influence. Therefore, we understand that this exchange is not like atoms make molecules, molecules make objects all the way up. No, this is not the case. So, in short, for me, the topic of comprehension is hardest to understand and to explain.
And here, in this passage, another important point is the description of man. The spirit needs to encounter the matter of these crude spheres, but it cannot be in direct relation to matter. Because of this, the spirit builds the being by composing of very subtle energies or influences. Still, the being cannot directly influence the crude spheres of the cosmoses. Because of this, the being needs to build a body for itself out of the matter of a crude sphere, hence, our body out of the world matter. This is human body. Because of this inter-influencing mechanism between these three incompatible substances, we now don't say that we have a spirit but say we are spiritual beings. So, we understand that our body is a vehicle built by the being to be in service to its spirit. Our body is built from the crude matter of our sphere. As the saying goes, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But the important point that needs to be underlined here is that this body is connected to a being, and this being is to be connected to its spirit until the end of the universe. The problem is for us, when we read or hear the word of being, we imagine a humanoid form, at best, a light body but in human shape, and we don't stop there but also assume that this shape has a self or personality like we have now. Yes, we tend to assume that our ego, our physical body or our personality is continuous in some way after death. However, we read in this book that what is continuous is our being. After death, this physical body of ours dissolves after death. What we experienced and learnt during a lifetime is transferred to our being. We will read the mechanism of this as we read and discuss the parts explaining the consciousness. Yet, what we call our personality or our current self is a structure shaped by the building of our body from the crude matters for this lifetime we have on earth. Yes, our body is in service to our being. I'd wanted to underline this. Another point is, as you said, our being projects a large portion of its energy and influence toward this point in time and space where and when our body exists. And also, we hear in this passage about the family unit duality. This time, opposites are a male and a female. And a new body becomes built from the genetic material of the male and the female. But as the embryo grows, what is used for its growth is the materials of the mother. Again, we read here that the being is not some energy entering into fetus and goes out when it dies. This is a mechanism of induction, just like the physics lab experiments we did in school with bobbins and dust magnet, and without a physical contact the dust magnet was assuming patterns, and this was telling us that through the magnetic fields, objects or matter interact, initiates and ends a motion. What we witnessed in the physics lab was the crudest form of the same mechanism. And if we apply this to the being, that's why Mr. Ruhselman was arguing against in his earlier book about the classical understanding of incarnation, which implies entering into body, into flesh and bone. He had explained that this is a mechanism of induction, influencing and directing the magnetic field. And here, we read that the most significant function is of the brain cell beings. And we heard first about brain cell beings in this book. And another very important point is, a human being, when dies and while in the spatium, still keeps these hundreds of thousands of brain cell beings together and keeps on influencing their magnetic fields. This was new for us when we first read this book. And what happens in the next body to be built by the being? As the embryo is growing in the mother's womb, the being's influential hold over the magnetic fields of myriad brain cell beings begin to influence and shape the brain cells of the fetus. And this is how the traces of the unfinished business of a past life, destined cause and effect chains or epigenetic traits is carried over to the new body. And if you remember the stages of development for the being, when a being completes its development as a single brain cell being, it passes to the next stage of becoming able to build an individual human body. So, we learn the function of an individual brain cell being and the process leading it to become able to govern an individual human being. Yes, as fetus's brain is constructed as such, the being constructs the other parts of the nervous system via this brain, and later it generates all other formations of the body via this nervous system. And this reminded me a book by a Dutch physician and neurobiologist, Dick Swab, and his book is titled We Are Our Brains. He explains the findings of various research showing that the roots of many illnesses and traits which will become apparent in a person's life are already established in that person's brain while he or she was in the womb. For example, diabetes, dementia, Alzheimer's, homosexuality, etc. And the writer says, we don't know what kind of repression or influence exists in the fetus brain that shapes it in this way. Yet, when we read this passage and the knowledge given in the further pages about the mechanism of consciousness, we become able to explain this unknown influence, that is, how the being shapes the brain of the fetus through the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cell beings of the previous body it has built. Yes, this is all I can say for this part we read.
When I consider the continuous assistance of the beings in duty to our being, it becomes obvious that there is no accident. You know, the most frequently asked question is how come one sperm among millions of sperms goes forth and impregnates that ovum? Let's try imagining the factors involved and taken consideration by the cadres of duty, the necessities outlined for the next body to be built by the being, the quality and level of development of the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cell beings which in turn that will be utilized in forming the brain of the next body, automatic or semi-comprehending approval of the beings that will be mother and father of the next body, the spiritual and developmentary needs of the new body to be born and live for a certain time period in a certain family within a certain community, etc., etc. And what is an individual brain cell being? More developed and evolved than an animal, and as we understand what we read in this book, it is in an intermediary stage between animal and human. This intermediary stage is not in our planet, for example, and an individual brain cell being, after completing that stage, will become one of the humans that will be at the first step of the human stage after this world cycle ends. Yes, we take our brains granted, but after reading this knowledge, we understand that within our skulls we carry a magnetic field synthesis, an organization of beings which is immensely developed, immensely complex. And as you said, the knowledge we read in this passage is so new. After a human dies, the organic body dissolves but the magnetic field of the deceased body's brain cell beings is kept under the influence of the being to be utilized in shaping the brain of the new body to be built. The influences from these brain cell beings get connected to the impregnated ovum, and as the brain of the fetus grows, they shape this new brain and all the related nervous system of the new body. So, we are talking about such a developed organization of cell beings. And when I read this sentence that materials of the mother are utilized in building the new body, I remember this saying of our grandmothers: gain a child, lose a tooth. It seems they could observe or had some intuitions about the result of this utilization of mother's material, especially if there is calcium deficiency.
Of course, it is not only physical material of the mother. We now read the research done in epigenetics about how traces and information of ancestorial traits, of the experiences of past lives, can be inherited with the DNA and RNA of the mother. Be it a tendency for an illness or a psychological state, the being forms and shapes the new body in accordance with its developmentary needs by utilizing all possibilities within this matter system. And even the mother is the same. We see different outcomes of all these factors taken into account for each new body. Just think about twins or families with many children. Also, psychologists say that a fetus can assume all feelings, emotions, and thoughts of the mother as its own. Until 5 years old, the children are like a sponge. And you are a new father. Now, you are witnessing how your kids' learning happen at once, that they are not empty pages when they are born, but actually even a few days old baby has a will, attitude to wrap you around his or her tiny finger. They give strong reactions to all stimuli. And behind all of these, there are immense mechanisms. If our friends may remember what we read about the first stages of the Plan of Duty, they can see the most important one of these mechanisms. The beings that reached the first steps of the Plan of Duty, they are assigned duties, for example, as a guiding being of a person. So, we can understand that once a being is built, all beings in duty, from the first steps to the uppermost steps of the Plan of Duty, become involved.
And at the last paragraph we read, the being prevailing over the human body is influential and governs directly over the magnetic field synthesis, which is constituted of the magnetic fields of hundreds of thousands of beings belonging to brain cells. That is, the body is managed by the brain cells. However, this management is under the governance of the energies ensemble, which is the being of the body and belonging to a spirit, of the human being. I think, this summarizes what we have discussed so far in a very succinct way. And the rest of the passage is about more details on the brain cells and comprehension. Maybe it is a good idea to answer a few questions before you continue reading.
Yes, let's check these questions. For example, can we say that our whole body is made up of brain cells? For example, are there brain cells in our hands? Well, what we talk about is how the brain of a new body is formed by the being, after the death of the former body it built. The hundreds of thousand brain cell beings of the former body are kept under the influence of the being, and when the being needs to build a new body, this organization of the brain cell beings influence the magnetic field of a fetus, and as they shape the brain of the new body, their influence also builds other parts of the nervous system, and this also includes the nerves related to the hands, as well. The influencing is done by the brain cells, but it does not mean that the hands have brain cells. We try to convey the knowledge about the interinfluencing through magnetic fields, so please don't take this as our hands have brain cells. Another question is, the beings projecting its energy into bodies during those 500 to 700 lifetimes, and these are perceived as different time periods in the world. Could it be that this projection at the same time in space, because there is no time and space? Well, in the further pages we will read that within the spherical time comprehension of the being, all those lifetimes happen at once from the perspective of the being. However, we act, live, think in linear time perception, in this hydrogen cosmos, the superficial time comprehension puts moments after moments, and we cannot understand this happening all those lifetimes in a moment. We will read about these different time comprehensions in the further pages. And we still measure time in space by light years, etc., so our astronomical cosmos is still bound by the superficial time because our measurements are bound by it. And also, please remember that the spherical time is out of our material system. So, please be patient. We have time to discuss time. And from the greater cosmos, let's go back to our small universe, our human body, and continue reading. At the initial terms of the embryo, influences are sent to the brain cells ensemble, only as much as necessary. The being does not leave the perceptual point of gathering that is particular to itself, which we previously mentioned, and does not spread out into the body with its general ensemble. By always preserving its state of gathering as a complex of energies or influences in that perceptual point, it only sends the necessary quantity of some part of its influences to the magnetic field of the brain cells. It connects to it by some part of its influences. During the development of the embryo, the evolution of the fetus, and finally, at the moment of man's birth, the quantity it sends and connects to the magnetic field of the brain cells increase as needed. And at the moment of birth, a significant amount of its influences become connected to it. According to worldly understanding, 7/8 of this energy's complex which exists in that perceptual point become connected to the body, and only a small part of it remains freely in that perceptual point. And this is what mankind calls incarnation. As it is seen, neither does the being enter the body nor has it spread out with its whole to the organs of the body. It preserves its wholeness, throughout the totality of bodily life, in the perceptual concentration point which we have explained. It sends a great part of itself out and connects to the magnetic field synthesis of the brain cells. It should be remembered that, in all of these, there again exists the assistance of sublime influences. Mankind calls the influence fields which are connected to these brain cells, unknowingly, only upon their observations, as consciousness. However, because the parts of the being which remain free and unconnected to brain cells remain unknown to them and to those around them, mankind has not been able to acquire clear knowledge about it.
Hearing the questions, I think there is some confusion about the brain cell beings, so let me express some points again. I think, 10 or 15 pages before, we had read about the organ-organizer relation, and it was not in vain, because when we understand how this relation is utilized in the cascade of the organizational inter-influencing, thinking our being as an organizer becomes easier. Yes, our being is organizer and our consciousness center is organ. Our brain is organizer, secondary centers connected to the brain are organs, etc. So, this organ-organizer stratum is arranged in levels in accordance with the developmentary level of the structures of matter and also, with the evolutionary level of the beings that get developed in those structures of matter. Now, when we say consciousness center, please remember that science cannot pinpoint a part in the brain because human consciousness emerges as a field, using different parts of the brain for many activities. And when we say brain cells, please remember that there are specialized cell groups for various functions, for example, neurons, in the nervous system, for example, ganglia, etc. So, all of these are named as brain cells in this book, and their magnetic field interactions are mentioned here as the consciousness center. A part of it is related with the comprehension, perception, another part is busy with managing the body organs. There are nervous stations, for example hearing center, and their numbers are huge. So, our being governs our body within this organ-organizer relation, by influencing consciousness center, and the influences are branched out to those stations throughout the nervous system. And here we read that the being projects a part of its energy in influence, as much as necessary, as the fetus is constructed, and by the time of birth, 7/8 of the being's energy is connected to the brain of the baby to be born. And all of these processes are under the governance of sublime energies of the superior beings. And please imagine the difference of a brain cell being's experience within the brain of a human body which built by the being for the first time and after the 600th body it built.
Building a human form in the Stone Age is different than building a human form in the postmodern age, especially human beings that came with the aim of finishing all their unfinished business before this world cycle ends. Imagine the complexity and intensity of the influences reflected and received. In the further pages, we will read that, at the beginning of these human lifetimes, because the being's comprehension is not experienced in focusing its energies properly, it is rather automatic and builds bodies under the directions of the being in duty, but later, the being gets involved in the plan with its relatively widened comprehension.
Your words reminded me the miscarriages or stillborn babies. Of course, there is no mention of such cases in the book, but when we think about the inexperience of the being at the initial stages of humanity, and of course, if the developmentary needs of a family is to be met in this way, such life plans may be outlined.
That is, the being is making a sort of exercise in building a body. Miscarriage is a natural process. That is, when an organ or organ system in the fetus is not properly developed, the process is terminated. Maybe, in such cases, the being is in the trial phase of connecting to the brain of the fetus, but if this cannot be done properly, we see a miscarriage happens. So, system is smart and when it detects an abnormality in the development, terminates the process. And what happens to the father and mother, especially mother? They experience various emotional and mental states. Another question. If the fetus is constructed from the mother's materials, can we say that a part of the mother's magnetic field passed to the child with birth? Do the mother and the child share the same magnetic field?
We should not think the magnetic fields of the mother and the child mixed or merged. We had seen at the beginning of the book that even the atoms come together to build molecules and bring out different elements, they still their particular magnetic fields intact. And the synthesis of the magnetic fields occurs not by becoming merged but maintaining their own values. Yes, when we look at a mother and child, they may seem like a single unit but it is only an appearance. In a similar way, when we look at our body, we see a single form but within our body, there are billions of beings with specialized functions and with their own particular developmentary needs. They are a part of the body synthesis but at the same time, each has their own particular magnetic field, and each is in a continuous exchange of influences with other magnetic fields of all other beings. In the further pages of the book, we will read examples of this harmonized exchange of magnetic fields, for example, the facial similarities of some couples, etc.
Yes, even our physiology changes accordingly, eh? And here, you and I with our friends who are online now for this recording, even though we are in different locations, we bring out a mutual field, a magnetic field synthesis. One of you asks a question and we try to answer it, hence, we exchange values and influences with our thoughts, feelings, imaginations. And when we look at the mother-child relation, yes, there is already an organic relation between them, and also, because the child grows within the magnetic field of the mother, the pregnant women are advised to be calm, not to be in mood swings, etc., because the fetus is influences by those states of the mother. And the fetus may assume intense emotions, fears, anxiety and images of the mother as its own, and recently it is discovered that only when the umbilical cord is cut, some separation from mother's emotional and mental imagery may begin for the child. Yes, there is a very close, almost intertwined magnetic field sharing between mother and baby. The child psychology names it as connection, but as the child grows up, the difference of their magnetic fields become more obvious. Still, this close sharing of magnetic fields plays a big role in shaping the personality of the child. However, as Ümit mentioned, what governs that baby is another being, different than the being of the mother. So, majority of the influences received by the brain cells beings of the baby is from its own being. But of course, the baby is within the family system, so the baby is influenced by the mother, father and the extended family members. Still, the baby is mainly connected to its being, please remember this. And baby's being is responsible of the magnetic field of the baby. Alright, let's continue reading. However, on the other hand, the being managing the man is a whole. Although it has left a small part of its own energies outside of the magnetic field of brain cells, that part, as well, in accordance with its wholeness and the necessity of its evolution, is not completely separate from the body but in a close relation with it. Nevertheless, its freedom is not complete. Actually, by means of the close relations between these two parts, that being utilizes the activities that aim at the evolution of its parts connected to the body in world, and by this way, the imperative of embodiment is realized.
We had previously discussed these topics mentioned in this short passage. Still, I can underline this phrase. Although the being has left a small part of its own energies outside of the magnetic field of brain cells, its freedom is not complete. Yes, that part of the being that is relatively free from the body is still in close connection of the body.
Well, this phrase you mentioned may give a clear answer to the questions coming from our friends, like does the being project its free part into other universes or other bodies? Does it go somewhere else, etc.? We read here, yes, that part is free but not completely free. This partially free part is in close connection with the projected part. The being receives influences from the guiding beings, other beings in duty. The being sends out influences to its body to form, to shape, to govern, to direct it. An immense exchange of influences, energies is going on all the time between the hydrogen cosmos our body exists and the semi-subtle realm our being resides as a perceptual point of comprehension. And here, our problem is our assumption that we are only one thing. However, the whole system works in a multidirectional manner. That's why the book describes this as a complex of influences. Yes, there is a one governing being, but within this organization that we call human body, there are myriad beings governing each organ and each cell of each organ. And all of these beings are connected to their spirits that continues their evolutions. That's why we call it as a small universe. Let's continue reading. The out-of-the-body state of the being does not directly impact on the consciousness of mankind. For, man can only become conscious with a certain part of the influences sent out to him by the being, and he tries to comprehend himself incompletely. Although, having some vague intuition of the parts that are not coming to him, he has nevertheless no clear comprehension about these. So, what mankind calls inner being, essential self, essence being, and sometimes intuit through a deep contemplation, are the relatively free states of his true being outside the body. We say relatively because although it is free, it is still obliged to follow all states of the body, to render the necessities of those states in accordance with the imperative of its duties in the world. This is its duty. Unless, with the death of the body, its connected parts become unconnected, it cannot use its free parts with complete freedom. For, indirectly, it cannot free itself completely from the imperatives of the body via its connected parts. There are compulsory fields of occupation which will always preoccupy it with its activities on its body, such as digesting, concluding the impressions it receives from the body through its parts connected to the body, in accordance with the evolutionary imperatives particular to that moment, and reflecting these to spirit.
The sentence that strikes my attention in this passage is, let me read, what mankind calls inner being, essential self, essence being, and sometimes intuit through a deep contemplation, are the relatively free states of his true being outside the body. And this reminds me the well-known poem of the Sufi mystic Yunus Emre. I don't say I'm inside myself. I'm not. The I within me is deeper than myself. And, here I see the solution to the problem you previously mentioned, that is, our assumption that we are only one thing. We can intuit this relatively free part of our being by deep contemplation. One of the most important things that will elevate our vibrations and quicken our development is our knowledge about our own inner world, because we can master it only if we can know it properly. And if we don't have any idea about our earthly cravings, how can we expect to loosen their grip? And if we cannot silence the noise of all those external distractions, how can we expect to hear the soft whisperings of our being? As we get more able to master the content of our inner world, as we become more discerning about the quality of the influences we invite to our organism, then those evolutionary values that built our being begin to reflect on our structure. We read here that our being has compulsory fields of occupation. It receives impressions from the body and reflects these to spirit. And also, it receives values from spirit and reflects these to the body, so the body it built can be more able to acquire higher quality impressions, so the being can widen its comprehension more and more. And what our body reflects to our being is not the three-dimensional imagery of the world but the meanings we glean from our experiences. Our being's communication is based on meanings.
The sentence strikes my attention in this passage is, with the death of the body, its connected parts become unconnected, it cannot use its free parts with complete freedom. For, indirectly, it cannot free itself completely from the imperatives of the body via its connected parts. So, we understand that even when the body dies, the being is not completely free from its duties related to the body. Because, there are other processes to be done by the being following the death of the body it built. And these processes vary according to the conditions of the death, the level of comprehension at that moment, the accounting period after death, etc. Because, the being will be occupied with assessment of the impressions received from the body because the resultant essential knowledge has to be reflected to spirit. Yes, time flew again. I'd like to thank our friends for their concentration, questions, and attendance. Together, we are supporting each other during those arduous times. Each of us has many hardships in our life, still, together, we are working to find ways of looking at these hardships from another perspective. And as we do this more and more, we find other meaning behind these hardships. And this is so important.
Because, when we look at the general situation of the world, we can see human beings that already gave up looking for meanings. And they try to feel the emptiness within themselves by addictions, substances, food, sugar, cell phones, TV dramas, etc. So, I'd also like to thank our friends for their efforts to overcome the attractions of earthly cravings and concentrate their attention for searching higher meanings.
Yes, we wish you a good evening. See you next week.
Good evening.